Have you heard of self-care? Is this something people have heard of? I'm seeing some. So yes, it is a thing. It depends maybe what generation you're from, but self-care is this thing that's very popular nowadays. Really what it is it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. There's fitness apps, wearables. I mean, iWatches are about, I actually don't have mine on today, but iWatches are about self-care because they give you so much information about your health. There is things like social media influencers, other wearables. I mean, there's so many things you can get. You can get smart beds. Well, really, it's a mattress cover that tells you all about your sleep. There is supplements, everything out there. There's so many things that are trying to help you take care of yourself. And then that doesn't count all the people trying to sell you courses and meditations and this and that to help you be your best self. Self-care is definitely one of the things that is super important today because people want to increase the quality of their life over the lifespan. Because the news is, we can live about as long as we're going to live, but you can, depending on how you live early in your life, it'll influence how you live later in your life, at least the idea. And I think the jury's out on how much you actually do have control on that. But this is what the industry is about. So self-care it's focused on your well-being, but it's also focused on your mental health and mindfulness. These are the words people will talk about. So it encourages people to slow down, to rest, to enjoy the small things. Meditation is a big part of this movement. And like I said, people even offer custom meditations. You can subscribe to apps. You can have influencers who have custom meditations you can buy from them. And these are about helping and improve your mental health and your mindfulness. So this is the sort of thing that's out there. Now, it's gotten to the point where it's gotten to the National Basketball Association, the NBA. I don't know if you've heard about this, but now they call it in the NBA, and it's in some other sports as well, baseball specifically. Football, there's just not enough games. The guys are playing every game. But it's called load management. So this is what they talk about. So it's a huge thing in the NBA right now. So like high-profile athletes like LeBron James and Steph Curry, both those guys are getting later in their career. LeBron's like pushing 40. Steph Curry's in his late 30s. These guys have been stars a long time. They're like, we want to be like Tom Brady. We want to play forever. And so they're like, how do we do that? And what they started to do is play less games. So between 2020 and 2023, Steph Curry only played in 75% of his team's games. So they play 82 games, and he averaged around 60-some games a season. And LeBron, in that same time frame, he only played in 63% of his team's games. So only 6 out of every 10, I don't know how that converts lower than that. What, 1 in 5? No, that's not right. 3 and 5. Gosh, my math is not good. I use a calculator. But the NBA, this was bothering them because they had people showing up to games and their stars weren't playing. They had nationally televised games in prime time and their stars weren't playing. So the NBA had to make some changes. They had to make rules and say, if you want to be able to qualify for MVP and you want to be able to get on the All-NBA team, stuff that matters for players to get better contracts, they said you have to play at least 65 games a year, which is only like, I think I did the math, not quite 80% of the games. So it's still not every game. And like I said, baseball, they're starting to do this too. Baseball, they're starting to realize that they can't play these guys for 152 games because a lot of them can't handle it. And that makes sense. Baseball plays every single day. They get like 1 day off a week, and sometimes that's the beginning of 1 week and the end of another week where you're technically playing like 11 games in a row. So that makes more sense. But NBA, they play 3 to 4 games a week. Sometimes they are stacked, and these guys are like, we want to slow down. So self-care is the thing. It's out there. And what's going on is the world is beginning to realize that we need rest. But this is the thing. Guess who's known we've always needed rest? God, right? So much so that he talked about rest since the beginning. On the 7th day, it talks about how God rested. Now, that might not exactly mean what we think it means, but it's an important moment that springboards into the rest of the way that God tells us to live. So this is what we get to talk about today. We get to talk about Sabbath. Not a word that comes up in many Christian churches, other than when we read the Gospels and we glance over it. But today we're talking about Sabbath. So if you take out your Bibles and turn to Mark chapter 2, that's where we're going to be today. Mark chapter 2, it's going to be 22 through 3:6. Page on the Pew Bible, if you want to follow along, it's page 1427. 1427. So Mark chapter 2, let's take a look at this passage and see how it opens up. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" All right, so we need to establish a couple things here before we can go further. We need to talk about first what is Sabbath. So the word Sabbath comes to us from Hebrew. It's basically a version of the Hebrew word shabbat. Now that just means rest, or day of rest is what it became known as. But Shabbat is the seventh day. Now we already read one of the two places where we had the Ten Commandments. That was the passage from Deuteronomy. Well, the first one that tells us is in Exodus. This is the first place the Ten Commandments are listed. And this is what it says about Sabbath. It says, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son, or your daughter, nor your male or female servants, nor your animals, nor any foreigner resting in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in it, or in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." So Sabbath is about resting 1 day a week. Now the Jewish people have done this all through history. They're the only people group that have done this, resting 1 day every week. Now, this is something we don't understand. We have a 2-day weekend every week, 2 days that we're not supposed to work. Now, many of us still work on those days. We'll talk about that. You can be working in a way that you're busy and you're not resting, even though you're not doing your weekly job. But for most of the human history, humans had to work every day. Because if you didn't know if you'd have food. You didn't know if the crops would be ready once you started farming. You had to make sure your animals were taken care of. If you were running a shop, you had to make sure that your family was provided for. You had to work every day. It was just assumed. It wasn't as if people didn't want vacations. It's just they didn't feel like they had an option. They had to work. But that's not how the Jewish people worked. They always had a Sabbath. So why did God give them this Sabbath rest? Here it talks about God did it because he rested on the seventh day. Now, like when we read that passage from Deuteronomy, it talked about we rest because God rescued his people out of Egypt. But in both cases, what Sabbath is connected to is humans' relationship to God. So we need to keep that in mind, because that's what this is about, our relationship with God. That's what this is going to come down to when Jesus has his discussion with his disciples. So in the days of Jesus, the Pharisees had come along, and they realized it was important to keep Sabbath and all these other laws. So they started to help people understand, well, how do you keep Sabbath? What does it mean to break it? What do you have to do to break it? How far can you walk before you break it? How much work can you do before you break it? Is it breaking it if you wash your clothes? Is it breaking it if you help your animal get out of a hole? They had all these rules they put in place to help people know how to not break the Sabbath. And so what's going on in this passage is Jesus' disciples are doing something that the Pharisees had already said, this breaks Sabbath, and they were picking grain to eat. On the Sabbath, you're supposed to prepare your food the day before. No food preparation is supposed to happen on the Sabbath, but they're picking the grain. And so this causes a problem because his disciples are breaking the Sabbath, and that's not okay. Now, again, before we get to Jesus' response, we really have to just step in and we don't understand this. We don't. We could not work for some people some people don't work for a long time because they retire. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. That just wasn't a thing that most people throughout the world had an option to do. But now we can go and get food prepared for us. We can buy food already prepared. We have pizzas you just put in the oven. Now, maybe that's called work because you have to push the buttons. But really, is it work? I mean, you got to go down to the freezer maybe and then cut the pizza. But we just live in a totally different world. We don't live in a world where what you do that day will affect your next day. Because if you don't get enough, there might not be enough for the next day. And if you have too many of those days, you're not going to be strong enough to care for your family and to provide what they need. We just don't understand that. So that was the world that was going on. And that's why Sabbath was a challenge, because it forced the Jewish people to stop and to trust God. Remember, it's about this relationship with God. So this is Jesus' response, because that was what it was supposed to be about. But the Pharisees were, okay, like, no, this is the rule that you're breaking. So this is Jesus' response. Verse 25. He answered, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. So Jesus responds with a story from the Old Testament about David. You can go look this story up. It's in 1 Samuel chapter 21, 1 through 6. If you want to get the whole context, you should probably read more than just that. But 1 Samuel 21, 1 through 6. But in this story, Jesus goes to a priest and he needs food for himself and his men. He's on the run from Saul. And so this priest says, I only have consecrated bread. Now, if you look at the footnote, probably in your Bible, I know for sure there's probably a footnote in the Pew Bible about this. It tells you where to go where it talks about consecrated bread. It's bread in the temple for the priests. Because the priests, they don't work normal jobs. They have to care for the temple and oversee everyone's worship life. And so they have bread that's specially for them to eat. It's the consecrated bread. So it's not for other people. It's not for David. But David is hungry and his men need food. And so David sees that as a greater need than following this law or this rule. It's really just a rule about not eating this bread. And the priest says, I agree, you can have it. As long as and if you read the story, he says, as long as your men have been holy and not done anything to be unholy, which is a category, things you can do, he said, well, then you can have the bread. Now, what does Jesus bring this up for? Jesus is making this connection. He's making this connection and saying that the need for his disciples, hunger, is greater than following this rule the Pharisees have made. It's more important for them to have what they need than to keep this arbitrary rule. Because Sabbath isn't necessarily about following the rules, it's about how you understand your relationship with God. And right there, you're hungry, there's grain that God caused to grow. Why don't you eat it? That's the idea. The other option potentially is that Jesus is making this connection between David and himself. But regardless, he's basically saying, I am able to make a special judgment about what is okay. And then he says this in verse 27, which makes this even stronger. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. And so what Jesus is saying right here is he's saying basically that for one, the Sabbath was made for humans. Humans aren't supposed to be slaves to it. It's to be something that helps them and something that is supposed to benefit humans, not the other way around. And he's saying, I am in charge of the Sabbath. So I can say what I want about it because I know what it's really about. That's what he's saying. So what it comes down to is Sabbath is a gift of God. Long before humans had discovered the importance of rest, for us, because we discovered self-care recently, we're like, oh, we need to not work as much. We need to care for ourselves more. Long before any of that, God knew that humans needed rest. And so he gave us this gift one day every week. But here's a question I really think we need to ask. How often do we actually rest? How often do we turn off the noise around us? How often do we set aside our phones, the demands of life, and realize that God has given us a day for rest? Americans in 21st century aren't very good at that. Now, before we talk more about the Sabbath in our life, there's one more story that Mark tells us about Jesus and the Sabbath. This is in chapter 3. Another time Jesus went into the synagogue and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." So this is another time. It most likely seems as to be after the first time, since they're unhappy with Jesus and trying to watch him to see if he's going to do it again. And this man has a crippled hand, and so Jesus is there. Now the synagogue is what the Jewish people did on Sabbath. Their Sabbath is the seventh day of the week, Saturday. And on Sabbath, they would go to synagogue, they would read scriptures, and they would pray. And so they're there, and there's this man whose hand is just not right. Now, the rule about healing was you really weren't supposed to help apply medical treatment to somebody on the Sabbath if it wasn't like a dire need or emergency or like a life loss circumstance. This man had been crippled his whole life, most likely, or at least for a long time. There was no urgency for Jesus to do it on the Sabbath. The idea is he can wait till the next day. And so that's why they're watching Jesus. They want to see, is he going to push their buttons or not? Is he going to go against their rules and break Sabbath? So let's see what Jesus does. Then Jesus asked them, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill it? But they remained silent. So now, instead of the first time Jesus had this encounter, he talked about an Old Testament passage. Now he asked them a question about the purpose of the Sabbath. Is it for doing good or is it for doing evil? Is it for bringing life or for taking life? This is the question. What is the purpose of the Sabbath? Is it supposed to be something that gives life to humans or not? Now, there's no answer. And Mark tells us that Jesus is frustrated. Look what happens. He looked around them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. He said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out and his hand was completely restored. Now, if you've seen The Chosen, I think maybe season 1, this is a series of events that happens in that show. I think they do a great job of imagining how it could have happened. And basically, Jesus, in both circumstances, is trying to sort of prod the religious leaders on. He's trying to challenge them intentionally. And I think that might be accurate. I think Jesus is trying to say something about the rules the religious leaders have. Because notice that he's deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts because he realizes they don't get it. So before we talk about the Pharisees not getting it, just take a look here at what happens. So after that, then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians, the people who supported King Herod, how they might kill Jesus. So in Mark's gospel, all the way in chapter 3, there's a plot that starts to form against Jesus. Now let's talk about what's going on in all this. Now, the Pharisees were interested in Israel's holiness. They wanted to make sure Israel kept the law because that's what they were supposed to do. What they understood about Israel's relationship with God is they had broken the law, and because of that, they had lost their land, they had lost their kingdom, they had suffered. And Jesus is pushing back and he's saying, no, it wasn't about keeping the law. It was about your relationship with God. And Sabbath illustrates that more than anything else. Because Sabbath isn't about keeping a rule. It's about realizing that it's a gift that God has given you. The Pharisees viewed the Sabbath as a religious ritual, something they had to strictly follow. So a lot of you probably experienced Christianity this way. All the rules. My grandparents are here. They can tell I've heard stories. Now, I've talked about the UB church a lot because we raised in that. So my grandpa will know because he was that his whole life. The UBs used to be you couldn't play cards, right? You couldn't drink any alcohol, no tobacco. I'm not saying these are bad rules. But I mean, our family likes euchre, right? So why can't you play euchre? Well, they're worried you might start gambling. So you just can't play any card games. No Go Fish. I don't know if that's actually the case. I don't mean to make fun of anybody. But this is how churches, this is how humans work. You know, we don't want to discern what is and isn't wise, so we just make rules. And that's what the Pharisees were about. But Jesus said, no, Sabbath is a gift of God's goodness. Sabbath is a gift of God's goodness. And that's how we should celebrate it and experience it. It's a gift because humans need to slow down and rest. And from God's goodness, because it's the way that God blesses us. This is what we need to remember. And this is what a lot of us aren't good at. We're finite. We only have so much energy. We can't go on forever. We need to sleep. We need to eat. We need to have water. We don't have unlimited energy. We are dependent on God, and Sabbath is a reminder of that. It reminds us that we need God, and that that's good, because when we observe Sabbath, what we do is we are embracing God's gift of goodness to us. We're embracing his blessing. And that's what Sabbath is about. What is it that we say during the Lord's Prayer? Give us this day, our daily bread. We're not asking God to give us bread for next week or next month. Just give us what we need today. Because what we need to realize is everything we have is already a gift from God. And Sabbath points that out to us, because Sabbath is a gift of God's goodness. It reminds us that all we actually have comes from God, which is why he said, okay, for one day every week, you're not going to work. For one day every week, you're not going to produce something, because you're going to be reminded you only produce anything because of me. And this is what Jesus wanted the religious leaders to learn. That it wasn't about following the law, it was about having this relationship with God where we realize how much we depend on him and how much he wants to bless us. And that's what the Jewish people lost sight of. They thought it was about keeping these rules, about following the laws. But it's not about the law. The law is just a sign, it's a pointer, it's a way of pointing us towards God's goodness. Sabbath isn't a religious rule to be kept. Instead, Sabbath is a gift of God's goodness. So we go back to this health or self-care craze, and yes, there's truth in it. As humans, we have limits, and we need to accept these limits. We need to realize that we can't do everything, that we need to take care of our bodies, that they can either they can be fed in a way that they flourish or not. We need to realize all of that. But self-care, what it misses is this, that God has given us what we need to live. So it's actually not something that we do. Self-care is about what can you do to make your life better. But Sabbath is about what has God given me that I just have to receive and be thankful for. And then recognize I don't have to worry about tomorrow as much as I sometimes think, because he will provide tomorrow. I'm not saying to be irresponsible. I'm just saying we have to have a really clear picture of what's going on. Because Sabbath is a gift of God's goodness. So here's the $1 million question. Should we as Christians be keeping Sabbath? I mean, this is almost not something no one thinks of. I mean, it's been decided since Paul, we think. We don't keep Sabbath. I mean, some of you grew up on Sundays like a Sabbath, but I don't know if you talked about it this way. I mean, you weren't supposed to go out to eat. You weren't supposed to do anything, have any fun. Just sit around and I guess just twiddle your thumbs. I don't know. I've heard those stories. I never had that experience. But I do think that Sunday or whatever day you want to be Sabbath is a day where you can embrace God's goodness. But maybe that means you do have fun, because you don't have a lot of fun most of the time. Maybe it's a day where you don't do that thing you need to do and you do the thing you like to do. And you say, it's okay because maybe I should slow down and rest every once in a while. Because Sabbath is a gift of God's goodness. So I think we should keep Sabbath. So Megan and I have been trying to do this. We're still learning. You should see the face she just gave me when I said that. This 24-hour period where we use our phones less. As in, like, we don't use them unless we really need them. We don't just get on them and scroll. We just put them away. We only watch TV if it's a family thing. So we're going to watch a movie together as a family. But we're not going to just let the kids sit with TV for a while. Because sometimes that happens. We're going to do things that we enjoy, even though maybe there's some dishes that need to be done. Maybe we won't do that. We're going to go outside. We're going to read a book. We're going to go for a walk. Sabbath is a gift of God's goodness. It's a gift that God gives to humans. It's permission for us to stop, to let the work rest for a day, and trust that God will be there to bless us in our absence. Because he wants to bless us, and he wants to be our source of life. God's goodness makes Sabbath this beautiful opportunity for us to connect with God, to trust him, and to enjoy the world he's given us. And that's what Jesus knew, and that's why he wanted the Pharisees to discover what it really is. Why shouldn't he heal this man? The day that God gave for his glory to be shown, why shouldn't the man's glory, or his hand show God's glory? Why shouldn't the disciples eat if they're hungry? The food's right there. So self-care is this thing that's out there. Maybe this is the first time you've heard about it. And let me just give you this little twist on it. Let me say it's a good thing. But it's a good thing because we got to remember that it comes from God. Remember that it's about Sabbath, because Sabbath is a gift of God's goodness.